Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with Jen Bentley, the Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
Well, thanks. It's good to be back and kind of a timely topic here. As I drove to work today, minus 20 below for temperature. So climate is always a good topic to discuss, right?
Yep, exactly. I think we're going to be called the tropics of Iowa today. We're only at -8. So I think we're the hot spot.
I'm going to move to Northwest Iowa.
Yeah. You know, talking about weather seems to be every farmer's favorite topic at most cafes, and I admit that the debates are always interesting. Today's guest will share his insights on our changing climate and what's ahead for weather during the upcoming growing season. Dr. Dennis Toddy is the director of the USDA Climate Hub in Ames. He will make the presentation. He is a native Iowan with his BS and PhD from ISU in meteorology and agricultural meteorology. He spent 2 stints in South Dakota, first completing his MS at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, and most recently as associate professor and state climatologist for South Dakota at South Dakota State University. He is a well-known regional speaker and media source on various climate issues and is the former president of the American Association of State Climatologists. Dr. Toddy, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. And yeah, it is a cold day, so it's a good time to be talking about weather and climate, isn't it?
Absolutely. Dennis, let's start by explaining what the Climate Hub is.
Sure, happy to do that. We are a part of USDA, even though we work very closely with Iowa State and other agencies and the other universities, but we are a part of USDA. There are 10 hubs nationally, and our job is to deal with regional weather, climate, changing climate issues in agriculture. These were spun up in 2014, 10 of them around the country. The region we deal with is mostly the Corn Belt. We go from Minnesota, Missouri, over to Michigan and Ohio officially, but then we do, we talk about my time in South Dakota. We bleed a little bit over into the Northern Plains and Central Plains because the corn and soybean areas are over there also. So we help support our hub in that region. And we have been capturing a bit more attention recently because of administrative priorities on dealing with climate issues. So we're being asked to do more relating issues related to the changing climate, trying to adapt to the changes that are occurring and hopefully help mitigate some future issues, because agriculture has an ability to help that out. So, basically regional, all things ag and weather and climate, that's us.
Dennis, help me understand what the difference is between climate and weather.
A very good question. There have been lots of analogies people have tried to throw out. One is like climate is your wardrobe and weather is what you wear that day. Or if you're a baseball fan, climate is your batting average and weather is your single at bat. What we're talking about when we talk about climate, we talk about something larger and longer term that kind of describes an area that describes an overall climate. Our climate in the Midwest, we have wet and dry, and we have cold and we have warm because we're in the middle of the North American continent. That means we can get very cold in the wintertime like we are now. We can also get very warm in the summertime because we're not near an ocean, so we can heat up and cool down a lot more. If you look at climates that are closer to the oceans, they're much more moderate, like Key West, Florida, or San Diego, California, the temperatures are very little throughout the year because they're moderated by the ocean. So that describes the overall climate. Weather is more those day-to-day changes or week-to-week changes that describe more of that variability, the smaller scale variability. Climates themselves do change over time, and we are seeing some larger changes in our climate overall. But that's the main difference we're dealing with. Climate is larger, longer term. Weather is those individual events that help make up the overall climate.
And Dennis, I think when producers are talking about their upcoming, crop years or past crop years, climate and weather are always part of that discussion. And, this year we had surprisingly good crop yields this past season. Can you comment just a little bit on the yields from last year and then what you think going into this year might look like?
Sure. You're dead on. That heard that same comment from a lot of people. We expected worse than we got than we ended up with last year because we had some fairly significant drought conditions in Iowa. There were additional bad drought conditions around us. Northern Plains still dealing with some and had some real severe problems up there. Iowa had some pretty good drought conditions, but overall yields were not too bad. And I think there's a couple reasons. We're still trying to sort out some of those issues, working with some folks from Iowa State on this one. We had some fairly dry soils at the beginning of last season. So when we planted into dry soils that I'm sure helped the root system development so that we were able to make use of any water that was available, even down deep in the soil profile. Some of the hottest temperatures we had were actually a little bit earlier in the season, like early June. So those don't hurt yields. Early June temperatures don't hurt yields quite as much as they do later. So by the time we got around to tasseling for corn, temperatures had eased a little bit, and we'd actually had a bit of a rainfall by that point. So we got us through tasseling. And then August, overall conditions in August weren't too bad for soybeans. So there were several things that happened that helped us get through and not be quite as bad as we would have expected last year to be. So looking ahead to this year, as I've unfortunately not been able to get out and do as many talks this winter as we would have, but been able to do some remotely and asking people, okay, what's your soil moisture situation like? And most people are saying, it's okay to the dry side. And that seems to be the case around most of the state. So going into the start of the season, that's not a bad place to be. There's a little concern there, but it's really not a bad place to be because that means when we do get some spring precipitation or when this snow gets around to melting, which it'll probably be into February now before we start doing any major melting of the snowfall here, then we have the soil is able to take up some of that moisture and not get us into a situation where our soils are too wet. So that helps me feel more confident that this spring will be a decent start for us to get rolling. Right now, we don't have any long-term scary things that we're looking at for this season. I'm using such technical terms as scary things. Right now, we don't see any major issues in Iowa right now. There are some in the eastern Corn Belt. They are wetter over there. And, we're going to talk a bit more about La Nina here. We expect some wetter conditions to set up this spring. That's probably going to delay some planting up or over in the eastern Corn Belt. Also up in the Dakotas, actually, they got wet near the end of the season last year after the drought. That's going to slow them down a little bit too. Right now, Iowa's not in too bad a spot. We do have some dryness that is with us that we're monitoring, but right now we're not too concerned.
During our webinar yesterday, you referenced a precipitation chart and a chart from the drought monitor. What's the difference?
Okay, that's another common problem we have, or a common misunderstanding of what's the difference between those two. Let's take the second part first. The U.S. Drought Monitor is a weekly product that is produced by an individual. They're all involved with the federal government and different agencies. Their job each week is to take the previous week's map, look at what has changed, who's had rainfall, who's not had rainfall and conditions are worsening, where are we getting reports of problems, and take into account a lot of these details and redraw a map each week. There's lots of national input from people like myself who have, and other regional folks who are able to say, hey, here's what we're seeing, here's what we think it should look like each week. So it's the Drought Monitor is a comprehensive view of trying to assess what's going on with drought across the country. And when you're looking at an individual precipitation chart, different amounts of precipitation, different time periods of precipitation are incorporated into the drought monitor. What have we had for recent precipitation, last 30, 60 days or so? What is the longer term precipitation looking like? 6 months, a year, 2 years, and even longer, depending on where you are. Some of the longer term dryness is really still affecting the drought monitor in the western U.S. If you look at the U.S. drought monitor for Iowa, and the new one was just updated this morning, there are still some places that are in D0 with the yellow color, which means we're abnormally dry, technically not drought, and then some tan areas that are D1 moderate drought. And you might say, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's still some areas of the state where we have some longer term dryness looking back to last 6 months or a year. There's still some dryness that shows up there, so that's why it's incorporated into the drought monitor. So those kinds of things, lots of different time scales, things like soil moisture, things like water supplies, short water supplies are incorporated, low stream flows. There's lots of different pieces that are incorporated into the drought monitor. And then in each area, they look at what's the evidence in that area, because you'll have a range of different things that indicate different assessments for what's going on. So it's, a precipitation chart is one piece, the drought monitor is all the pieces. Say the precipitation chart is one piece of the pie, the drought monitor is the whole pie. What's the whole pie look like? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You're saying, well, we're short of precipitation here. Yes, but we've had some precipitation. And Iowa's a good example of that we've had some fall precipitation, so things got better, but especially even longer term, we still got some dryness in the longer term that we would like to get rid of.
And Dennis, you mentioned the La Nina just a little bit ago. Where are we at with La Nina and El Nino?
Good question. Always a topic near and dear to my heart, since part of my PhD was working on those two and trying to assess what they look like in the Midwest. When we're talking, again, a reminder, when we're talking about La Nina or El Nino, we're talking about two phases, opposite phases of sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, kind of along the equator in the Pacific Ocean. El Nino is warmer than average waters. La Nina is colder than average waters. And La Nina is where we are right now. There's colder than average water in that area. Now, while that's, it seems like it's a long way away from us, it does influence what happens over the U.S. It's not a direct relationship, but there are relationships. And oddly, this year has been, if you look at what has happened in the way of temperatures and the way of precipitation, it's been very prototypical of what we would expect from a La Nina event. Doesn't always work out that way, but this one has. So we're in La Nina, and when we're in La Nina during the wintertime, there is better chances of colder temperatures in the northern plains, which has really happened, and some of that cold does come down over us, which we're seeing right now. And then you tend to be warmer to our south and to our east, and that's kind of worked out that way so far. Precipitation standpoint, what we would expect during a La Nina winter is that there's a chance of a little bit better chance of precipitation again in the northern plains, and that kind of arcs over to the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley to our east. Iowa sits kind of in the middle of that. And then if you look at the plains like Nebraska and south, there's a better chance of dryness in that area. And that's really what's happened this year. The Ohio Valley has been wet. Great Lakes, a little bit wet, not too much. And then the northern plains have been wet. And then the central to southern plains have all been dry. So it's lined up really well. We expect that La Nina to continue through the spring. So it will continue to affect the outlooks going into the spring. And the new outlooks that were issued this morning do reflect that quite a bit. We expect wetness to continue to our east. Eastern Corn Belt, Ohio Valley, and parts of the Great Lakes are more likely to be wetter. Some of the northern plains continue to be wetter. And then some cold is going to hang with us into the northern plains and maybe likely affect us through the rest of this month, maybe a little bit in early February, but some recent indications are some moderation starting in February away from this cold.
And Dennis, as I visit with producers about weather or climate, they comment they're noticing changes in precipitation. Are we seeing those changes here in Iowa as far as precipitation goes?
Most definitely. This it might sound odd compared to what we talked about with dryness last year, and drought still is part of what we deal with. But if you look at data over the last century plus, time period, we are seeing more precipitation overall in the state and the upper Midwest. More of that is falling outside the time of year where we expect or where we want it to be. More of that in the late winter, early spring into early summer, and then in the fall, where we're seeing bigger precipitation events in the fall, and those are completely opposite what we want to have for agricultural production, because our crops all need more of that water in that midsummer time frame. So yes, we are seeing overall changes in amounts of precipitation. We're also seeing rainfalls fall in bigger events, and that's not necessarily a good thing, especially when they're falling at those times of the year where there's not a crop covering a field, because we're getting some bigger rainfall events, and multiple inch rainfall events generally aren't very good anyway. But if you get, even 1 or 2 inch rainfall events on top of soils that are uncovered, if they don't have a crop, or if they don't have a cover crop of some kind, you have a great chance of losing soils and nutrients, topsoil and nutrients in those situations. So that's, part of the big reason why there's a big push towards soil health. And there's a big push recently towards, for this affects, they're doing things that affect the climate, but it's also better for the soils of trying to reduce tillage, trying to get cover crops, doing anything we can to make sure that soil stays where it is. Because that soil is our first line of defense toward a changing climate. When you lose soil, you lose the water holding capacity, we lose the organic matter. So that overall is a downside for your crop production. So we want to do things to change how that soil is. And in fact, there have been some recent changes that we're seeing more of that precipitation I mentioned going to the spring and fall, and actually a decrease in midsummer precipitation. And that's a scarier thing for me in our region, because one of the reasons our agriculture is so productive is, one, we have great soils, but two, the time of year when crops need the most water in the soil, that July, August timeframe, then we're seeing less precipitation. So more in the off seasons and less in the summer. That's backwards. And that's really concerning going on. So there are changes. We're going to continue to monitor them. And that's part of what we do as the Climate Hub, is trying to help people understand these changes and encourage adoption of practices to deal with these changing conditions and protect our soils and our crop productivity.
Dennis, I know you mentioned that, we're probably going to be planting crops in a bit of a drier soil this spring, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But let's look at the broader picture and go back again and talk about how's this growing season shaping up?
Sure. Unfortunately, long range forecasting throughout a growing season is we're still not capable of giving people everything they want to know. I'd love to be able to do that, but we still can't. So we focus on the things that we do know. It is likely that we're going to be at least a little dry going into the growing season. I mentioned we've still got some snow melt. Overall, our springs are getting wetter, and it is possible, especially in the eastern part of Iowa, the outlooks do lean a little bit on the wet side. Again, I don't think that's going to be a major problem. The western part of the state, I mentioned the eastern part of the state, has a little better chance of being wetter. Doesn't mean the western part is going to be dry, but there's less chance of precipitation in that area. But I'm still not concerned overall. As we go ahead through the growing season, there is likely going to be drought around the Midwest somewhere. There is every summer. Just trying to pin down where those drought areas are and how big they will be. Still not able to give a good handle on that. Mentioned again, maybe some in Illinois, but definitely Indiana, Ohio, maybe parts of Michigan down to Kentucky along the Ohio River area has a better chance of being wetter and delayed in the way of crops being planted this spring. So I expect to see some delays there. I expect, Iowa and especially the plains to be ahead of the game unless we get really wet and really cold here in the spring. I don't expect to see a problem with that. For people who follow wheat conditions, winter wheat has kind of been taking a beating. I mentioned the drought conditions and dryness in the plains. So they're going to see some problems there. Haven't seen any major concerns with winter wheat in the eastern corn belt overall. So right now, I don't have too big a concern. I think it will probably be, we don't do forecasting of yield for the major crops, but right now I don't see any major issues other than some initial delays in the Eastern Corn Belt.
So we haven't talked about wind yet. And I guess there was a question yesterday on the webinar about winds. Are we having more windy days and higher wind speeds than we have in the past?
That's a really good question. But when the first fall I came here after being in South Dakota, I was meeting with some regional climatologists in that fall, talking about what the fall had been like and anything they had noted. And I said, it hasn't been as windy this fall. And they reminded me, Dennis, you moved to Iowa from South Dakota. It's going to be less windy. So, there's always perspective in how we look at these things. We have had some very large wind events last year. And the derecho that did, major crop damage across the central part of Iowa. And then we've had a couple other major wind events this fall with a strong storm system that had some very strong winds later in the fall. And then the December severe weather event had very strong winds with a December derecho. That's a pretty uncommon thing to add to the list of uncommon things going on. So, there are these events that make it seem windier. We don't have as good of data longer term on things like wind and humidity as we do like on temperature and precipitation. We've been measuring temperature and precipitation in good detail for well over 100 years. Those other measurements, we don't have as good a data over a long time, and there's been changes in how we measure wind that kind of confuses the issue. Overall, the data don't seem to indicate that we're getting wetter overall, we're not getting windier overall, or there's not been any major changes in wind. There is a lot of variability in the wind in different seasons, different parts of the year, and with big events, but the data overall don't seem to indicate any major changes in overall wind.
Thanks for all the great information you presented here today, Dennis. And as we conclude, do you have any last reflections you want to share with our listeners?
No, I appreciate you having me on. It's always fun to talk about these issues and address issues to try to help people make better decisions. And, and that's what we're trying to do, is to help people understand the changing climate issues, see them coming ahead of time, and be making decisions in the shorter term that can alleviate or avoid any major issues, and to hopefully look longer term in our thinking about how we deal with the longer term climate issues. That's what we're trying to do here at the Hub, and also working with our Iowa State partners, trying to share with Extension about what's going on. We will also work with Justin Glisson, our state climatologist, to try to help ISU Extension and partners out in understanding what's going on and dealing with the climate issues that we're facing.
I do want to note that the webinar you presented this week will also be posted on our Extension Dairy Team website, and we'll include the link with this podcast for those listeners who want to see it and gain a more in-depth interpretation of the information. Again, thank you, Dr. Dennis Toddy from the USDA Climate Hub, for being on this podcast today.
Happy to do it. Always glad to chat with people about it. And I guess one more thing, if you check out our website, just Google USDA Midwest Climate Hub. At least once a month, more often during the growing season, we do a written update on ag climate issues if people want some more updated issues that they can get their hands on.
Thank you for that information, and thanks to our listeners for joining us today. We look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.